We're going to be looking at rates of reaction in regards to respiration, which is the reaction that you're going to actually be doing some experiments around. And as you know, respiration is how the body breaks up glucose using oxygen to create carbon dioxide and water, and they're the waste products. And at the same time, they take the energy from the glucose and they store it in this little molecule called ATP. So that's respiration, a quick review of what that is. But the big thing with respiration is the rate of respiration is critical to how we function. If you don't have enough of this transfer of glucose, the energy in glucose, to make ATP, if that is slowed down or limited, then you're going to be low on energy, which is going to affect how your body can function. The chemical reactions that keep you alive, all of them are slowed down or even stopped if you, of course, don't have ATP. So we're going to be looking into factors that affect the rate of respiration. Now, essentially, the first thing you've got to do is think about how do we get the reactants, which are the things that start our chemical reaction, how do we get them to where they need to go? Because it can't just be that they have to be present in your blood. They actually have to get from your blood into your cells and from your cells into the mitochondria, which is where this chemical reaction occurs. So here we've got glucose and oxygen in our capillaries. They're the tiny, fine, they're not arteries, they're not veins, they're actually both. They're the little end point where arteries turns into capillaries, which then go back into veins in our circulatory system. And they bring glucose and oxygen to our cells. Now, the first thing we tend to run out of is not glucose, but oxygen. That's the big factor that tends to run out. Because if you don't stop breathing, you immediately run out of oxygen within about 3 minutes. So we're going to be looking at how oxygen is affected in this chemical reaction. Now, glucose and oxygen have to get across our capillary walls here. Now, these walls here, these ones here, are like 1 cell thick, and they've got to get across those walls into the cell, and then from the cell, they have to get into the mitochondria, which is where this reaction happens. Now, that movement is dependent on a few things. First of all, it's dependent on diffusion, which is the random movement of particles, and that random movement of particles is based on energy. Okay, you can't move randomly without energy. Heat energy specifically. Now, the other way that they get into that cell is something called active transport, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We're just going to focus on the diffusion aspect. So the rate at which these reactants get into the cell and into the mitochondria, that diffusion there is going to limit how fast that reaction can occur. If you don't have a lot of heat energy to allow those particles to move into the cell, then you're going to actually end up having a slower reaction. So heat is essential to diffusion, which is essential to getting the reactants to where they need to go. Now, on top of that heat, allowing for movement of molecules, the other thing you've got to think about is the diffusion of molecules. The diffusion of molecules is also dependent on concentration gradients. In other words, it will always tend to move from higher concentrations to lower concentrations. So the only way we get movement from the capillary into the cells is if we have a really high concentration of glucose and oxygen in the capillaries and less of a concentration in the cells. And if you don't have that, then you won't have any net movement at all. Why? Because, as we've already spoken about, everything's going to be moving in and out and in and out. When it comes to oxygen, it can literally go both ways in and out of the cell. So all of these oxygens are moving all around the place, and all of these oxygens here are moving all around the place. But if you have more of them over here, more of them are going to tend to move this direction than those that will move that direction. In other words, you have what we call a net movement of oxygen into the cell. Okay? So concentration is also another key factor that we have to take into consideration when we think about actually getting the reactants into the cell in the first place. If you don't have that concentration gradient where it's greater in the capillaries than it is in the cell, there won't be a movement of glucose or oxygen into the cell to actually run the reactions in the first place. You must have that concentration difference, or as we call it, gradient. Concentration gradient. In other words, think of it as just like in maths, slope, your gradient. There has to be a difference from one area to another, a gradient. So that's another thing that actually affects the rates of the reactions. Getting the reactants in there is temperature dependent and it's concentration dependent. It's also dependent on the concentration of any waste products. Now you think about it. These guys have got to hit together in a specific way, in a specific format in order for them to react. They don't just float around the cell and hope that something's going to be able to happen. They have to collide in a specific way to have this reaction happen. But if you've got a whole heap of these waste products, let's have a look at the waste products. Look here. If you've got a heap of carbon dioxide and water and ATP and other stuff in the way, then you're going to have the way blocked, because you're going to have CO2. I'm just going to change that color there. CO2. If you've got lots and lots of CO2 here, it's actually going to get in the way of the glucose and the oxygen combining and hitting. So you've got to actually get rid of your waste products, because if they actually get built up in the cell and aren't removed, they will actually slow down your chemical reaction because they'll interfere with the collisions between the glucose and the oxygen. So the other reason we have concentration gradient here is in those capillaries, there's a very low concentration gradient of CO2 at the same time over here. And because of that, most of these guys here will tend to move out of the cell into the capillaries and be taken away so you can breathe them out. In other words, you need to remove the waste using a concentration gradient again so that you can actually have your chemical reaction happen, because otherwise, if waste builds up, it will actually bring the whole reaction to a halt. Anyone who knows what it's like, your body systems, if you get constipated, it can kill you. Waste becomes poison. It interferes with chemical reactions. It stops reactions from happening, and it will kill you in the end. So waste removal through diffusion again is really important to allow those chemical reactions to happen. So in a nutshell, here's how I'd summarize it up. Rates of reaction and respiration are affected by how quickly we can get reactants into the cell and into the place they need, and how quickly we can get them out of the cell so that they don't clog the system up. And it's also dependent on the concentration gradients of those, the concentration gradient and the temperature of those molecules, because that will affect diffusion of those molecules. There's also another piece of the puzzle, which is enzymes, but we're not going to go into that today. Off you go.